African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, religion, and social work. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Alma Carten, who's Associate Professor of the Aaron Krantz School of Social Work at New York University and co-author with Dr. James Dumpton of the book Removing Risks from Children, Shifting the Paradigm. And I know, Alma, as you shift this paradigm, you can certainly look at the foster care system in New York City and state. And just to begin the conversation, what are some of the things that are happening in foster care that suggest that we really need to shift the paradigm or the thought process that we use in working with children, particularly African American, Latino, and low-income children?
I think probably, as you know, Roscoe, I think that every citizen in New York is probably acutely aware of problems of the foster care system, child welfare system. I think that there's daily a day that passes when we don't hear some horrible story about some tragedy that has happened with the foster care system. So clearly it's a system that all New Yorkers and indeed all American citizens are concerned about. One of the things that of utmost concern is that the foster care system originally started, the foster care system was to be a temporary placement for children whose families were having difficulties. Over time, it's a system that's grown to be permanent care for children, and it's also a system that's continued to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And currently, I may not be exactly correct on the statistics, but we have over 500,000 children in the foster care system, and in New York City alone, we have nearly 49,000 children in the foster care system. And so we have clearly an issue that we must face was not only to prevent children from entering into the foster care system in the first instance, and to, if children do have to enter into the foster care system, we have to ensure that they have high quality care, that they are quickly reunited with their own families, and if this is not possible, that we move them towards an early plan of permanency, adoption, and permanent family homes. And we have that; those are challenges that we've been facing for a number of years. And that's not to say that it's not a very, very difficult system, and the challenges that we face are indeed very complex. And so the book...
Well, let's look back. If we look back 50, 60, 70 years, as you say, there was really very little or no foster care, but there were orphanages, and there were institutions that children were placed in, and the concept of foster care, I guess, was to put them in a home with some caring adults so that they could, in a temporary situation, be cared for and possibly eventually lead to adoption. Now, what went wrong? For example, you wouldn't suggest that we go back to orphanages, and of course not.
Of course not.
But on the other hand, something that was well intended, like foster care, now is being criticized because of its lack of caring for children, because it splits up families, etc. Sociologically, how did that develop? Why did that develop?
See, I think that's a very interesting question, and I think that is really, you really have to go back in time to understand how we got to this point. I think that sometimes people forget that early on, orphanages were really not orphanages in the sense of orphanages, children who were parentless. Early on, you may have had children living in orphanages, but they were basically children of the poor. And often, if a child was in an orphanage, that the parent would come and visit, and the parent would come and pay for the child's upkeep, support, not pay for it because they were typically poor parents, but contribute to the cost of caring for the child in the orphanage. And if a family remarried or if a family was reconstituted, the child would return home. So I think we have to kind of think about orphanages early on, and what orphanage at that point in our history looked like, as opposed to what we've heard some people setting forth as alternatives now to place children in orphanages. We also know now that orphanages, we know now that children need are best develop best in home settings, in family home settings. So for the most part, most people would prefer, most professionals would say that there are some children who need specialized settings because of some limitation that they may have. They may need special treatment and so forth. But that for most children, and I would even venture to say for all children, that given what we know about child development, psychological growth and development, that children need to be with families as opposed to orphanages. The question about why this system grew, despite, I would add, policies that were put in place to provide the kind of resources to keep children in their own homes or prevent family disruption in the first place. Now, why that happened, I think that moves us to another set of issues that may kind of move into political areas, a whole set of other issues. But
So you're in the profession, social work, which is a very old profession. Started, I guess, with people who wanted to do good, and then they professionalized it. And in your book with Dr. Dumpson, the former dean of the Fordham School of Social Work, you entitled it "Removing Risks from Children, Shifting the Paradigm." Now, of course, paradigm is an academic term. Could you explain what you mean by the paradigm, and then talk about some of the things that you considered when you thought about removing risk from children? I think you're focusing on African American children, but basically you're talking about poor children.
I'm talking about poor children, and we focus on African American children, excuse me, because when we look at the child welfare system, the foster care system, you find that African American children are overrepresented. When you look at the child welfare system, you find that poor children are overrepresented. But so much of what we say we think is good for any child, but we focus on African American children because of their disproportionate representation among the foster care system, and also because poverty is a one risk, is a one factor that severely increases risk for children, family disruption, and of course African American children are overrepresented in the number of children who are poor.
Would you suggest then that if we didn't have a large amount of poverty in the African American community, we wouldn't need much foster care, there wouldn't be many risks for children?
I think we would go a long way to removing risk from children. I think that certainly families would still need, bringing up children is a very difficult task, and all families, I think that irrespective of their economic status, would need certain support services. That it's very difficult for families to take on the task of rearing a child solely under their own resources from infancy to adult years. It's just an impossible task.
And we have a change in the family structure where we have working mothers. In the families 50, 60 years ago, most 60 or 70% of the mothers were in the home. Now it's just the other 60, 80% are in the workforce.
Exactly.
So you want to shift the paradigm. What do you mean when you say shifting the paradigm?
I think when we talk about shifting the paradigm, this book is based on a strength perspective. We believe that all families, and I will say all families, with appropriate supports can provide healthy, nurturing home environment for their children. We think that African American children, because of discrimination, lack of opportunity, inequality, and so forth, we haven't always recognized that there are strengths within the African American children and African American family and community that we should build on. So this is one aspect of shifting the paradigm, but also more importantly, not more importantly, but equally of equal importance is that you were talking earlier about the history of child welfare services. When you go back in history, and I don't want to sound too much like an academic,
but you are.
But but early on in this country, we sort of our social welfare policies were kind of based in an Elizabethan poor law heritage, and that heritage said that if you were poor, we did not want to trust you with rearing a child because we were concerned about intergenerational transmission of dependency. And so one of the earliest responses to poor families who were not able to financially care for their children, we removed the child from the home. What did we do? We placed them in almshouses then later it became orphanages and so forth. But we continue that tradition throughout history of removing children. When a parent was having difficulties, the immediate response was to remove that child from the family and place that child in a safe, more what was considered a better place for them to grow and to become self-sufficient, productive, tied to the work ethic and so forth. But that condition has continued, and what we've done, and Dr. Billingsley, Andy Billingsley, who talks about the strengths of families, black families, was one of the first social scientists to write in that area, talks about how we have policies that demonstrate that over the years we have unnecessarily removed many children from their families. And if we look at the system today, we know that most children in the system are not in the system because of physical abuse, sexual abuse. Most kids are in the system because they are poor, because they're inadequately fed, sheltered, or clothed, and it's not because they are being physically abused by their family. So the book is really suggesting that we shift the paradigm. We change our perspective from removing children from what we see as risky environments, risk-filled environments, to removing risk from children, creating safe communities for children to grow and thrive.
But one of the main ways of removing those risks is to get jobs for the parents.
Yes.
And unfortunately, particularly in terms of welfare reform, we have people being expected to work when they don't have skills.
That's right.
Which then raises the point is, in terms of removing risks from children, you've got to remove risks from families, which means you've got to provide education and training for families, which this society does not seem to be willing to do.
We have not done that, and we haven't, and this is another aspect of the book. And we also address welfare reform in the book. Megan McLaughlin has a chapter on welfare reform. We're looking at the issues, the implications that welfare reform might have for the child welfare system.
See, everybody is criticizing welfare reform in specifics, but in general, they're saying the system doesn't work. Now, how do you, and when you try to reform the system, not enough money is put into the system for child care, not enough money is put in the system for job training. How do you rationalize this? You're an academic, but you're also an activist. Dr. Dumpson has years and years of activist experience. How do you rationalize this academic position that welfare reform is bad, it's wrong, and so on, yet the society doesn't seem to recognize it and put the resources to make a change?
Well, I'm not really sure that I would say that welfare reform is bad. I think that everyone would agree that our old system was not serving its purpose. It is a fact. I mean, the reform is based on the assumption that something is wrong with the recipients, and the reform is based on a lot of false assumptions about the characteristics of welfare recipients, public assistance recipients, and how they are using public assistance programs. So, but I think that everyone would agree that the system is in need of reform. Now, we've taken a very, very punitive approach to reforming the system. I think that as a citizen, as an academic, I would say that all of our welfare policy should somehow be supported towards strengthening and supporting families.
What are some of those things that could be done in this policy to strengthen families?
In welfare policy?
Yeah.
It's in public welfare policy. That's difficult to say, but I think that...
that's what the politicians say, and then they go to the academics to tell us how.
Well, I think, excuse me, I think that all of social welfare policy has to be based, all public policy, social policy has to be based, and that includes economic policy, because we've often separated economic policy from social welfare policy. And our economic policies, like those that you speak to, lack of full employment, minimum wage, those create the kinds of problems that you have to develop social welfare programs for. But I think the one thing we have to begin thinking about, what we do, I think we address issues in the child welfare system, we address issues in the public welfare. We have all of these little separate systems of looking at and planning programs. But what we have to do is somehow, and that's a very difficult thing to do, somehow we have to develop integrative systems. All of what happens in public welfare reforms certainly will have an interactive effect on the child welfare system, and we'll probably see that as time goes on. We'll see more of that as time goes on. But one point that I want to emphasize from my perspective, as a academic, as a activist, as you call me, thank you very much, is that no matter what we do, it has to be based in an ethical, moral framework, that we think and we talk about these things as being very scientifically based, but in reality, what we do, our social welfare policies are not based on fact. They're based on people's values and beliefs and assumptions, all of those kind of personal reactions. And I think that what we have to do for children, I think what we have to do is value children, value families. We have to recognize that children, the welfare of children, is very much linked to the welfare of their families, and that the welfare of families is very linked to the welfare of communities. We have to see all of this together. But Dr. Dumpson sort of, he gives us a charge in the beginning chapter. One of the first chapters of the book is called, the title of that chapter that he writes is entitled Creating a Caring Society. So at the first step, you have to have an ethical, moral approach that says we will treat all of those in equal ways. We will create the kind of society, policies, and so forth for every child, irrespective of their color or whatever.
All right, well, let's take a specific situation, and this happens over and over again. You have a family that has dysfunctional parents, alcoholics, drug addicts, unemployed, and the 2 or 3 children, 4 children are living there. How can a caring society keep that family intact when they have that overlay of problems that's going to immediately spill over to the children?
Now I'm going to speak like a social worker. You're talking, and many families, going with one, many families do. That many families do have present. You use the word dysfunctional. I'd like to think about them as families who are confronting multiple problems. As you know, that when you have, these problems don't exist in isolation. If a father is not working, and I don't want to minimize it or simplify it because it is very complex, but if a father is not working, he's not capable of carrying out basic activities that impacts on his feelings of self-esteem and so forth. It may lead to death, may lead to family conflict between, it may, if you live in a community where drugs are easily available, that means that that's an avenue that you may choose. But a social worker, I think that the families in the child welfare system, the social work is a profession that has the highest visibility in the field. So I think that one thing you want to make sure you would do an assessment of the family to determine what kind of services that they would need. What can you do? How do you intervene? How do you provide supports?
But if this assessment takes 6 months,
no, right?
And then the children get in trouble.
No.
I'm really raising the questions that the public is asking.
I hear
How
that,
do you deal with these situations, which are away from the mainstream, in this theory that you want to keep the family together? And that is a dilemma.
No,
I'm
that's
sure.
an excellent. I mean, that's an excellent way of putting it, because there are various stages. We talk about this continuum of child welfare services. The first stage, I would say the first stage is that it should really be that we would have some means of identifying families before they reach the state of needing to come to the attention of the child welfare system. We have many programs and we have many services. We have churches, we have community-based organizations that hopefully it would be good if parents, families could feel the need to, would be able to come to those before they reach the state that would bring them to the child welfare system. But we do have a continuum. We have protective services, and this is like the front end. This is where children, you come to the attention of the system, and this is where we do have a quick response rate. The child welfare system needs to improve in many ways, but there are also some things that it is doing well, and I don't think they get enough credit. I think that the current Commissioner Scarpetta and his senior staff and people that I know in the system work very hard. But the first step of protective services, when the child comes to the attention of the public child welfare system, well, it's here that you really are going to have to make some very quick, can't do it in 6 months or that's not, you know, everybody's in trouble. It's got to happen very quickly. So that you have to make some immediate assessment about the level of risk of the child.
Now that's a judgment, and we see that in the press all the time. You've got these two parents that have these very, very serious problems, fights, not sleeping, not feeding the kids, and so on. The society says, take the kids away. You say, keep them in the family. How do we work that out?
I'm saying make some informed decision about what is in the best interest of the child. In some instances, it may be such that this family is confronting so many problems or is so, quote, dysfunctional, that at this moment in time, we need to remove that child from the family and provide some services for the family to get them ready to receive their child back. That has to be an assumption. We cannot say, let's remove the child, not maintain the contact with his family, and ignore the family and not provide them with services. And unfortunately, that's what we've done in the past. So what we're saying is that you really need to make some very in-depth assessments about what is in the best interest of the family. You're doing that, what's in the best interest of the child, and you're doing that within the context of the family, and you're doing that as your highest standard that you're using is a consideration of the safety of the child. But there are many ways to protect children.
Suppose the family is resistant. How do you, because these things don't operate in isolation. Many times people in poverty live in groups of problems and the like. There is the extended black family. There are some supports. And you talked about strength. How do you integrate those strengths with these problems that you point up with some of the problem families? How do you build on that?
Well, one of the things that you spoke about, extended family, that's been noted to a considerable strength of African American families. And there is a child welfare program, the kinship program, that if a child has to be removed from their family because of all of those immediate dangers that you point out, that you place that child in a kinship home. That may be with a grandmother, that may be with an aunt or so. And in that sense, you're removing the child from a risky situation, but you're also preserving the concept of family. The child still has a tie to his biological family. That's one way of integrating strengths in your work. The other way of integrating is that it may sound simplistic, but in my experiences as a social worker, is that most families, even the most troubled families, love their children. They may not be expressing and may not have appropriate child caring knowledge about child rearing and practice and discipline and all that, but they do care about their children. And I think that when we talk about family resistances, we often place that the root cause of that resistance within the family, within the individual themselves. But we also need to go and look at the system. We also need to look at the system. What is it in the system that's precluding families from being involved?
Talking about the system, you are now the head of whatever it takes to change the system. What specific changes would you make in the system and the society that relates to the system?
Well, that's a hard question. I had one job that I had, which I really liked a lot. I was interim commissioner of the child welfare system. Now they're out of the child welfare. It was in child welfare administration. I was there for a little short period at a time when Barbara Sable, who also has an article in the book. So I was in that position. There were some things that were accomplished. And it's interesting, Roscoe, that sometimes my students would say when I would tell them that I had done that or was doing that when I was also teaching, they'd say, how in the world did you manage such a huge agency with so many problems? And this is what I said. I had no experience of managing an agency that had 2,500 employees, a $1.4 billion budget, always on the front page of the. But here's what I said. I had a simple principle that I used. Were my child in this system, what would I do? How would I react? What kinds of policies would I want to see emerge if my own child was in this system? And that's very simple principle, that very simple standard helped me to make some decisions, and I hope make some small contribution to the. I don't think that you're able to solve. I think no matter how skilled you are, no how competent and caring you are, that you're not going to be able to solve all of those problems, because the problems are rooted in larger social systems. You point those out: economic system, jobs, all of that. Problems are rooted there. But while you may not be able to solve, I think that you can solve all of it. I think that you can make some significant contributions. And we did. We put in the kinship